Sit back, close your eyes, and let yourself be transported to a world of kings and castles, stone walls and echoing halls, silken gowns and muddy streets. But this is not a story of glorious battles or forbidden romances. No, this tale peels back the silk curtains of history to reveal something far more human, a truth shared by every peasant and every crowned monarch. The need to go imagine daily life in medieval Europe. The clang of blacksmiths, the smell of roasting meat, the flicker of torchlight along narrow corridors. Now subtract all modern convenience. No flush toilets, no sinks, no sewers, just chamber pots, open pits, and whatever corner the wind would. Take the stench away from the throne. Where did kings go to relieve themselves? Did the sovereign of England rise from his four-poster bed and stroll to a royal lavatory? Did a trusted servant stand by with a velvet-covered pot ready for his Majesty's signal? Or did he, like his subjects, simply aim for a hole in the stone, hoping the wind was favorable? Sanitation in the Middle Ages wasn't just inconvenient, was dangerous. Foul air was thought to cause disease, waste piled up in the streets. And in some castles, secret passages were built just so royalty could go in peace, safe from assassins with poisoned daggers. The throne, quite literally, was not always the safest place to sit. This is the side of history that makes you smile, wrinkle your nose, and say, wait, what? A side often left out of textbooks, but central to understanding daily medieval life. Because, in the end, whether you wore a crown or cleaned stables, nature called the same way. So let's step into that world, not just to see how they fought and ruled, but how they squatted, squirmed, and sometimes sat on golden seats with a view. Welcome to a story about toilets, thrones, and the odd intersection between power and plumbing. Let the journey begin. Morning sunlight slipped across the stone walls, breathing golden life into the cold corridors of the castle. The stables had just been cleaned. The kitchen fires crackled with rabbit stew simmering in iron pots. But there was something else creeping through those ancient stones, a smell. It wasn't new. It had lived in the castle longer than most of its occupants. Every servant awoke with a wrinkle in their nose, knowing the day would begin not with prayer or purpose, but with an invisible, inescapable fog of stench. It wasn't the animals or the rotting food. No, this odor was more private, more persistent. It seeped from the hidden spaces carved into the castle walls. The latrines. These latrines, often just holes in thick stone leading to the outside world, did their job only so long as the wind cooperated. When it didn't, foul air rode the draft right back into the halls of power, wrapping itself around tapestries, armor, and silk like a cruel, mocking ghost. A servant moved silently through the corridor that morning, carrying a wooden chamber, pot with silver handles, the king's personal vessel. His expression was blank, but inwardly he recoiled from the task. Emptying a royal pot wasn't a job. It was a humiliation wrapped in duty. The vessel held not just waste, but the unspoken hierarchy of the kingdom. Even here, especially here, someone had to clean up after power. Talk of toilets was rare among the castle's inhabitants. It was something to be endured, not discussed. But no amount of royal silence could mask the truth from the nose. Behind the king's chamber, a narrow passage led to a carved-out alcove in the outer wall, a secret fortified place meant for privacy and protection. And yet, over the years, cracks had formed. The smell always found a way in. Perhaps the king didn't notice, or perhaps he did, and chose to ignore it, the same way one might ignore a dying candle or a ticking clock. Physicians, however, noticed. They warned of bad airs bringing illness, and when coughing guards multiplied in the courtyard, all eyes turned suspiciously to the latrine chimneys. There was even a story, whispered among the kitchen staff, of a nobleman who died one stormy night while relieving himself in the wall latrine. A gust of wind, a slip on mossy stone, and down he went, from throne to grave, in one tragic fall. Ridiculous, yes, but not entirely unbelievable. This was the paradox of the castle. Grandeur on the surface, wrought behind the walls, in a world of polished silver and glittering crowns. The quiet decay of waste lurked just a stone's breadth away. History, it seems, does not only dwell in scrolls and battles, but in the hidden places, the ones that stink and yet reveal the most. The cobbled streets of the medieval town began to stir as the sun climbed over the slanted rooftops. Chickens flapped across the alleyways, dogs barked at passing carts, and merchants began shouting their morning greetings. But beneath the noise and life, something else slithered between the stones, the daily tide of human waste. There were no underground sewers, no public latrines with running water. Instead, each household, from the butcher's shack to the baker's loft, relied on the humble chamber pot. By dawn, these pots were full, and with no plumbing or collection service, the disposal method was both simple and horrific. Open the window and throw a splash, a warning shout, and the contents of the pot would fall into the street, where it mixed with horse dung, rotting vegetables, and the occasional dead rat. The town's lanes became rivers of filth, their flow determined by gravity and luck. Children played barefoot beside these streams. Old women tiptoed with their baskets, whispering curses when they stepped wrong. The morning cry of garderobes, lo, French for watch out for the water, became a warning shouted before tossing waste from upper floors. It was both absurd and accepted, a grotesque ritual of daily life. Heads ducked, skirts lifted, and the cycle began anew. For the poor, there was no privacy. Many lived in single-room homes shared with livestock. They did not have the luxury of stone alcoves or hidden latrine holes. Often a shared wooden seat was placed over a barrel or pit in the corner. The smell lingered in the air, clinging to clothes, mixing with the scent of firewood and sweat. In the market square, a public midden, a communal waste heap, overflowed. Flies danced above it in black clouds. The stench was unbearable in summer, and yet, somehow, life went on around it. Lovers met by its edge. Peddlers sold salted fish just steps away. Illness, of course, thrived in this environment. Diarrhea, dysentery, and plague found perfect homes in the filth. But the people didn't understand microbes or sanitation. To them, the air itself was bad, cursed by the stars or angered by sins. They burned herbs, hung rosemary in doorways, and wore fragrant pouches around their necks to ward off invisible poisons. Yet, amidst the squalor, there was resilience. People adapted. They cleaned with rags, washed with cold well water, and lit candles to mask the smell. Jokes were made, songs sung, and babies born all within spitting distance of humanity's waste. The streets told a story the nobles rarely heard, one of survival, not in battle, but in rot, of people finding dignity where dignity had long fled. And in the end, perhaps that was the true miracle of the medieval city. Not that it rose, but that it endured. It wasn't disease, nor death, nor public cries that first forced the authorities of medieval cities to act. It was the king's own nostrils. During a royal procession through the capital, the monarch had barely reached the town square when he gagged beneath his perfumed handkerchief. The stench of the streets, ripened by summer heat, assaulted even the most fragrant oils. Nobles behind him muttered and held their sleeves over their faces. What should have been a triumph became an embarrassment. The next day, the town's bailiff stood before the mayor with a trembling voice, reading aloud a new decree hastily penned by the royal scribe. No household shall throw filth from windows between sunrise and sunset, upon pain of fine or public shaming. A noble law, a doomed effort. Few could read, fewer cared. The smell remained. Still, the order marked a beginning. In the years that followed, scattered attempts at hygiene appeared across Europe. In Paris, city officials hired men called rakers to shovel filth from the streets at night and dump it beyond the gates. In London, a primitive drainage system was carved along alleys, narrow channels where water and whatever else flowed with it could run away from the market stalls. But these were fragile systems, constantly clogged and underfunded. Corruption drained city coffers. The rakers drank away their wages. Drainage ditches filled faster than they emptied. Enforcement was a joke. A woman caught emptying a chamber pot onto the street during daylight hours was supposed to be fined. But the fine was often waived if her brother served in the city guard or if she shared her wine with the local clerk. The people, meanwhile, mocked the efforts. They painted crude drawings of the king holding his nose, or wrote songs about how the crown fears the smell more than the sword. Public sanitation had become comedy, yet something had changed. For the first time, cities were admitting that filth was not just a fact of life, it was a problem. Murals in churches began showing hell not as fire, but as rot, and sermons warned that a foul body led to a foul soul. The first latrine taxes were introduced a few pence a month to fund waste removal. Of course, few paid, but the idea lingered. The city's cleanliness, once no one's concern, had become a mirror of its ruler's pride. If your capital stank, so did your reign. The king's nostrils had spoken, and while they couldn't clear the air, they had stirred the wind of change. In the quiet stillness of the king's private chamber, a man in long crimson robes dipped a sprig of lavender into a bowl of vinegar and began waving it in slow, ritualistic circles. The king, seated nearby and wrapped in fur, looked on with vague amusement. "This will drive away the miasma, Your Majesty," said the man, Master Giggum, the royal physician. His face was pale, powdered, and marked with the thin lines of someone who rarely saw daylight. But his words carried the weight of sacred knowledge in the Middle Ages. Disease was thought to come not from bacteria, but from bad air, the dreaded miasma. Foul smells weren't just unpleasant, they were considered deadly, and so physicians, like Guillaume, declared war not on germs, but on stench. He had designed a complex regimen for the king's daily defense. Rosewater gargles in the morning, frankincense burned at midday, and dried orange peels stitched into his robes. Servants were instructed to crush mint leaves and scatter them underfoot. Tapestries were washed in vinegar. Chamber pots were to be emptied before dawn and sealed with waxed lids. The physician himself wore a pouch filled with rosemary, cloves, and camphor around his neck. To guard the humors, he would say. His chambers smelled like a spice merchant's cellar, pungent, dizzying, sacred. Not everyone shared his faith. Soldiers joked that he feared a fart more than a sword. Courtiers mocked his theories behind closed doors, mimicking his sweeping hand gestures and muttering about evil vapors. But the king, ever fearful of plague, humored him. One afternoon, Gig'em took his obsession further. He demanded that latrine shafts in the royal wing be covered with leather flaps, scented with rose oil. Any servant caught leaving a pot uncovered was to be whipped. He even tried to convince the council to build smoke tunnels beneath the floor, to funnel out the poisons of the air. When the queen fell ill with fever, Gig'em blamed a chambermaid's perfume. The scents clashed. He cried, one sweet, one foul, they created chaos in the air. He was half laughed out of the room, but the maid was still dismissed. Despite ridicule, Guillaume's practices spread. Other nobles adopted similar rituals. In Florence, a duke began carrying a crystal orb filled with rose petals. In Prague, court physicians bathed sick patients in wine vapor. Across Europe, scented cloths became more common than soap. It wasn't science, but it was belief, and belief was powerful. Gig'em would later die not of plague, but of a fall from the latrine stairwell, ironic, if not poetic. Yet his legacy lived on in the form of perfumed rooms, holy water sprays, and the eternal effort to mask rot with roses. In a world where the air could kill, the war against stink was fought with petals and prayers. Amidst the squalor and stench of medieval towns, a strange oasis began to rise, warm, damp, and humming with laughter. These were the public bathhouses, or, as they were called in many places, the stews. At first, they seemed like miracles, built near rivers or heated by massive brick furnaces. These spaces offered running water, clean towels, and most precious of all, hot steam. For a few copper coins, even the poorest citizen could escape the filth and enter a tiled room where soap, warmth, and silence reigned. The bathhouses were often gendered by hour. Women in the morning, men in the afternoon, or separate rooms divided by curtains. Naked bodies soaked together in large wooden tubs, gossiping, sighing, scrubbing. Steam curled from copper kettles, and bundles of herbs hung from the rafters to sweeten the air. They were places of physical renewal, but also of suspicion. The church watched with narrowed eyes. To be naked with strangers, even for cleanliness, was morally dangerous. Whispers began of sinful touches beneath the water, of bathmaids who lingered too long, of privacy that gave way to temptation. Clean skin, they warned, could lead to a dirty soul. Some cities banned co-ed bathing altogether. Others imposed curfews or demanded clerical inspections. In one notorious case, a priest was caught bathing alone with a merchant's wife. Both were exiled, though the bathhouse was allowed to stay. The tension was clear. The body needed washing, but the soul must remain untouched. Despite criticism, bathhouses flourished. Travelers recorded them in their journals with awe. In Nuremberg, entire bathhouse districts sprang up with signs advertising steam, soap, and stories. In Florence, wealthy families built private bath wings beside their gardens. Even kings, once reluctant, had heated tubs installed in their summer palaces. Of course, not everyone could access this luxury. The rural poor still relied on cold rivers or wooden barrels filled with boiled water. But in cities, bathhouses became sanctuaries and sometimes battlegrounds. When plague struck, bathhouses were among the first places closed, not because they spread disease, but because authorities feared steam opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to evil airs. Cleanliness, once praised, was suddenly seen as dangerous, and yet people kept returning. The need for warmth, for human contact, for the feel of clean skin beneath fingers, it outweighed fear. Some even died dreaming of a final bath, as if purification could follow them into the grave. In a world soaked with filth and fear, the bathhouse stood as both a rebellion and a refuge, a place where flesh and spirit could briefly align or clash beneath the rising steam. The bell rang slowly in the fog-draped morning, once, twice, 3 times, each toll marking another death. By the time the sun crept above the cathedral spires, the street below was already half deserted. The plague had arrived. At first, no one knew what to call it. Some said it was a curse sent by God. Others blamed a comet seen weeks prior. But the most popular theory was whispered on every corner. The filth had turned deadly. The city's waste, long tolerated, had now become its executioner. Rumors flew faster than ravens. The sewage pits beneath the city, those choked with human waste, rotting meat, and stagnant water, were said to belch up black air, poison that slithered through windows and into sleeping mouths. People tied bundles of sage and rue to their belts. Mothers smeared vinegar on their children's cheeks. One baker sealed his chimney with wax, convinced the smoke carried death in a desperate act. The city council ordered all latrine pits to be burned. Rakers were summoned to dig out decades-old filth, douse it with pitch, and set it aflame. Black clouds billowed into the sky. The city choked, but still the dying did not stop. In the poorer districts, the panic turned violent. A rumor claimed that foreign merchants had dumped plague-filled refuse into the wells. Crowds dragged traders from their homes, beat them in the streets, and set fire to their market stalls. Water itself was feared. Wells were boarded shut. Buckets were filled. Only from church fountains. Inside homes, people turned on one another. A coughing child might be abandoned. A sneezing husband locked in the barn. Some families sealed their doors with wax and prayers, refusing to even bury their dead. Meanwhile, the royal physician, not Guillaume, but his nervous apprentice, declared that a city without waste would be a city without death. He ordered the digging of deep underground trenches lined with salt and ash, promising they would trap the death vapors. But the trench collapsed on the first day, burying 3 workers alive. Above the chaos, a strange kind of silence fell. No more songs in the bathhouses, no gossip in the markets, just bells and rats. Yet, amidst it all, a few brave souls continued to clean. Old women with rags, monks with carts of herbs, boys with wooden shovels scraping gutters clean. They had no science, no protection, only hope. And when the plague finally ebbed and the streets filled once more with life, it was said that death had retreated not because of fire or prayer, but because someone at night, beneath the towering walls of Castle Aldenbrock, a group of grimy men worked in silence. Pickaxes struck stone with slow precision. They were not soldiers, they were tunnelers, and their target was not a gate or a tower, but the castle's sewer shaft. During a siege, every resource became a weapon: food, water, patience, and even filth. The castle's latrine system, once designed to carry waste away from noble bottoms into a dry moat, had become a vulnerability. Its narrow stone chute, concealed behind the eastern wall, led straight down to a cliffside drain, but the enemy had found it. Under cover of darkness, they crept through the refuse, holding cloths soaked in vinegar over their mouths. The smell was unbearable, but the prize was worth it: a direct passage into the heart of the fortress. Back within the walls, the defenders suspected nothing. The stench had always been there. When a guard reported hearing a strange thud near the latrine chute, he was told it was probably a loose bucket or a rat the size of a cat. But the attackers had no interest in stealth alone. In one infamous battle, the Duke of Trell employed an even filthier tactic: poisoning the sewer system. Buckets of animal entrails, rotting meat, and crushed hemlock were funneled upstream into the waste chutes of a besieged castle. Within days, illness spread like wildfire among the defenders, not by blade, but by bow. Some castles tried to protect themselves. Engineers built S-bend tunnels to prevent reverse flow. Others used stone grates with murder holes above them. If an enemy tried to crawl up the waste tunnel, they'd be greeted by boiling oil or arrows from above. Still, the problem persisted. Waste, once considered beneath notice, was now studied by military strategists. Maps of castles included their sewer lines. Siege plans were drawn not just on paper, but in mud. Perhaps the most shocking example came during the siege of Regensburg, when a small boy, the son of a castle cook, volunteered to climb down the latrine pipe and warn the king of the advancing tunnelers. He emerged hours later, covered in filth, but hailed as a hero. The pipe was blocked with stone that very night. In times of war, every tunnel was a gamble, but none more so than those filled with human waste. It was a battlefield of silence, darkness, and rot, a place where honor went to die and victory reeked of shame. And yet, time after time, men returned to these tunnels, because in the end, no moat, no wall, no battalion could withstand a determined man willing to crawl through a kingdom's excrement for glory. Lord Egbert of Monmere ruled his valley with an iron fist and an iron stomach. His subjects feared his taxes, his punishments, and most curiously, his toilet dot. Unlike the common folk who squatted over planks or barrels, Lord Egbert had commissioned a grand structure atop his keep. A double-seated stone latrine, carved with lion heads and lined with imported Spanish tiles. It had 2 arched windows for contemplation, a mural of St. Eligius painted above, and a servant stationed outside at all hours. Visitors were expected to admire it. When the Bishop of Bron visited one autumn, Egbert insisted the tour begin not with the chapel, nor the wine cellar, but with the throne room. He opened the polished wooden door with theatrical flair. Behold, where the body humbles itself, but the dignity remains. The bishop coughed, the scribe took notes, the servants rolled their eyes, but Egbert was proud. To him, this latrine was more than plumbing, it was power. Only those deemed trustworthy were allowed to use it. A noble denied access was considered politically slighted. A guest invited in was flattered beyond reason. He even hosted meetings inside it. His steward would stand in the archway, reading grain reports, while Egbert sat comfortably, cloaked in velvet, relieving himself beside burning incense. He claimed it helped him think clearly. The construction had been expensive. The stone shipped in carts from a distant quarry, the seat polished weekly with beeswax and wine. A funnel system led to the cliff edge below, where waste was supposedly carried by ravens to the forest. In truth, it collected in a miserable trench. The people of Monmere began calling the structure the Second Throne. Satirical songs were sung by traveling minstrels. He rules from above and relieves from on high, the Lord on his throne with stars in the sky. Egbert banned such songs, but secretly laughed at them. His obsession with cleanliness was equally theatrical. Before and after using the latrine, he demanded a perfumed towel, a silver basin, and a prayer from the castle chaplain. No one else was permitted to enter the chamber uninvited, save for the boy responsible for warming the seat on winter mornings, when a rival lord attempted to build an even grander privy. Egbert had spies measure the size of the seat. Finding it larger by 3 inches, he ordered a new throne, carved this time with golden hinges, and a motto in Latin, Imperium ex cloaca, rule from the drain. It became his legacy. His son would later inherit not only the lands and titles, but also the peculiar seat, which had, by then, become cracked and haunted by years of ceremony. And though time would forget most of Egbert's laws and wars, the people would forever remember the Lord who turned a toilet into a temple of pride. The road stretched for miles beneath gray skies. A knight in chainmail rode ahead, his squire behind him and further back. A slow-moving cart carried provisions, weapons, and a bundle of chamber pots, clinking like wind chimes. In medieval Europe, the traveler's greatest foe was not bandits or storms. Where could a noble, a monk, or even a bard find privacy on a road surrounded by trees, mud, and eyes? For most, the answer was simple. You didn't. Bushes, riverbanks, behind ruins, all became impromptu privies. Knights relieved themselves in the forest, squatting in armor if they had no choice. Monks often carried cloth scraps folded into leather pouches for such moments, washed in streams and hung to dry in the sun. Some travelers carried portable wooden seats, small folding stools with a hole cut in the center. These could be set over shallow pits dug with boot heels. Wealthier nobles, however, employed road latrine chests, wooden boxers lined with straw and sealed with waxed linen, carried discreetly in carriages. Once used, the waste would be buried or dumped far from camp. For ladies of rank, the issue was worse. In some cases, traveling tents had side compartments used solely for private functions, perfumed with dried flowers or resin. Hygiene on the road was grim. Water for hand washing was rare. Soap was precious. Most used vinegar or scented oils to mask the inevitable odors. Pilgrims, whose long treks brought them across kingdoms, often smelled like beasts before they reached their sacred destination. One famous poet joked that the only way to know a true traveler was by the mud on his boots and the trail of his scent. And yet, Travel meant freedom. The road, despite its discomfort, offered what many castles could not: the open sky, the silence of trees, and the promise of a new place. In camps, communal pits were dug, often behind tents, sometimes beside bonfires to mask the smell. But etiquette varied. One knight wrote in his journal that a companion once relieved himself beside the food tent and was beaten with a ladle in full view. There were mishaps. Tents collapsed mid-use, horses panicked at the wrong moment. In one tale, a minstrel fell into his own latrine hole during a rainstorm and had to be pulled out with a bowstring and a prayer. Yet, through all this, the journey continued, because, in the end, whether king or commoner, all travelers shared the same humbling need, and the road, though wide, offered few places to hide from it. The monastery of St. Aurelius stood alone on the hilltop, its gray stones worn smooth by wind and prayer. Inside, life moved to the rhythm of bells, for waking, for eating, for praying, and for relieving the body to the outside world. Monks were figures of mystery, shaved heads, bowed heads, hands folded in eternal reverence. But even the holiest men had earthly needs, and the monastery's design reflected it with humble precision. Tucked behind the cloister garden stood a long, low building known as the Reredorter, the latrine house, built with thick stone walls and wooden seats arranged in a line. It sat above a flowing stream that carried waste away. The monks believed the running water symbolized spiritual cleansing as well as physical. There were no doors. Privacy was not prized. Silence reigned even here. A monk would enter, lift his robe, sit quietly, and leave without a word. A communal act in communal silence. In winter, the cold bit through stone and cloth alike. In summer, the smell lingered in the still air, softened only by herbs planted outside the windows: lavender, sage, thyme. Young novices were tasked with scattering ashes and lime, a sacred chore to keep rot at bay. Before and after using the latrine, the monks washed their hands and feet, believing that purity of the body prepared the soul for prayer. A stone basin, carved with a Latin inscription, Corpus Purgatum Spiritus Elevatum, stood near the entrance, a cleansed body, a lifted spirit. Once a week, the brothers gathered to clean the latrine as a form of penance. No complaints, no grumbling, only soft hymns sung under their breath as they scrubbed the stone and poured fresh water. Cleanliness here was not vanity, it was devotion. Rules were strict: no talking, no lingering. One monk, Brother Tomas, once carved a joke into the wooden seat: "Here I sit, for sins and figs." He was made to sleep in the garden for 3 nights and copy the rule of Saint Benedict by candlelight, and yet humanity found its way in. Brothers passed notes during long waits. On especially cold mornings, they would trade warm seats like relics. Once, a cat gave birth beneath the stone arch. The kittens adopted as silent companions. Even in this sacred place, the body remained a truth no robe could hide. The latrine was not a shameful corner of life, but a reminder that even those who lived in silence, who sought the divine, still walked the same earthy path as every other soul. Here, holiness met humility, and in the echoing stillness of the Reredorter one could hear the whisper of something greater, carried not in incense, but in flowing water. In the flickering glow of a hearth, Old women whispered warnings into the ears of wide-eyed children. Never relieve yourself after sunset, unless you want the devil to follow your scent. For many in medieval Europe, the toilet wasn't just a place of physical necessity. It was a gateway to something unseen and unclean. The fear of nighttime elimination was rooted deep. It was said that evil spirits roamed freely after dark, drawn not by blood, but by waste. Chamber pots were kept tightly lidded, sometimes covered with cloth bearing religious symbols. Some families placed small crucifixes beside them, as if to ward off invisible demons climbing through the cracks in the floorboards. In villages where indoor sanitation was rare, outhouses stood at the edge of fields or forests, lonely, creaking, and cold. Their legends were born. One such tale told of a man named Hobart, the baker, who went to relieve himself under a moonless sky and never returned. They found his pot, still warm, beside a pair of scorched boots. To some, these were stories to frighten children, but others believed. Amulets were worn against latrine demons, small tokens carved from bone or pressed from tin, depicting protective saints like Saint Fiacre, the unlikely patron of bowel ailments. Midwives warned pregnant women never to use the privy during storms. The lightning makes the air mad, they said. A bolt might enter the body through the most vulnerable place and take the baby with it. More than once, latrines were blamed for possessions. When a girl in Bruges began speaking in tongues, her parents claimed it began after she slipped while squatting over a pit and fell halfway in. A priest performed an exorcism at the site. Monasteries weren't immune either. In one chronicle, a monk reported hearing weeping beneath the Reredorer floorboards every midnight, the soul of a penitent, they believed, trapped between purification and decay. Not all beliefs were terrifying. Some were oddly comforting. Farmers in Wales buried flower petals in latrine trenches, hoping to sweeten the spirits below. In the Alps, people wrote wishes on birch bark and flushed them away with the morning waste, believing streams would carry their dreams to river gods. But even the bravest knights carried habits born of these superstitions. Many avoided relieving themselves before battle, fearing it would spill the soul. Others refused to use latrines built over flowing water, afraid their reflections might be stolen by creatures from below. In a world lit by fire and haunted by shadows, where disease and death crept silently, even the most natural acts were touched by fear. The toilet was no longer just a tool, it was a portal. And so, people whispered prayers before lifting the lid, as if bracing themselves not for what left the body, but what might enter it. The banners flew high, the trumpets blared, and barrels of wine flowed like rivers. It was a day of celebration. In the courtyard of Castle Marylebone, nobles danced, minstrels sang, and commoners pressed close to the outer walls, hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal bride. But as with every great event, there was an unspoken problem brewing below the silks and garlands. The latrines were full, not just occupied, overwhelmed. Castle Marylebone had been designed for a court of 50. That day, over 600 guests had arrived, and only for functioning privies stood within reach. The rest, crumbling or flooded by spring rain, had been declared unusable, but the festivities went on. At first, guests tried to be polite. They waited. They whispered complaints. Servants rushed to empty chamber pots in corners of the courtyard, then behind tapestries, then, in desperation, under banquet tables. Someone mistook a covered pot for a soup tureen. That moment was not soon forgotten. A noblewoman fainted in the corridor. A knight cursed and retched after slipping in a hallway puddle that was not wine. In the kitchens, cooks began wearing cloth over their faces, swearing the air itself had turned against them. The royal steward, red-faced and sweating, ordered the digging of emergency trenches behind the stables. They were hidden with hay bales and surrounded by screens of linen. It helped a little, until a horse broke free and trampled through them mid-procession. Down among the common folk, the situation was no better. People relieved themselves in alleyways, doorways, and wherever they could find a shadow. The town reeve, in a moment of wild inspiration, rang the dung bell, normally used only in times of plague, to direct crowds toward the riverbank. By evening, the stink clung to every velvet cloak and feathered hat. The newlyweds, smiling from their high table, were blissfully unaware, or at least pretending to be. In the following days, rumors spread faster than news of the wedding itself. The Duke of Ulswich soiled his boots behind the rose garden. Lady Torella used her bonnet as a cloth. A minstrel's song ended mid-verse when he was hit by a thrown chamber pot. The castle's chronicler, tasked with documenting the glorious union, devoted an entire page to the unspeakable smells that did sour the mood and cause strife. Future events at Marilon would include far stricter latrine planning, including wooden tokens issued for timed access. And yet, through all the chaos, the celebration continued. Because in Ortacak, as in life, joy and discomfort walked hand in hand. Beneath every crown was a stomach, behind every banquet a need, and even in the grandest halls, nature refused to wait for an invitation. In a modest cottage tucked between the fields of Devonshire, a mother knelt beside a small wooden bowl, whispering a rhyme to her toddler son. "Sit and wait, don't tempt fate, lest the devil mark your gate." This was toilet training, medieval style. Forget porcelain, forget plumbing. The first lesson for every medieval child was control. Not over their environment, but over their own body. And it started early. Most families used simple wooden chamber pots, often shared among siblings. In wealthier households, these might be painted or carved with decorative scenes. In peasant homes, they were plain, cracked, and frequently mended with leather or rope. Training often began around the age of 2, depending on the child or the patience of the parents. Mothers used songs, chants, and stories to coax children into sitting still. One popular rhyme warned that accidents would attract toad spirits who nested in soiled linen. There were no diapers in the modern sense. Babies were wrapped in swaddling cloths, sometimes several layers thick, which absorbed messes, but also made changing a time-consuming ordeal. These cloths were boiled in ash water and hung in the sun to dry, a process that left them clean, if not exactly soft. Children were expected to learn fast. There was little tolerance for repeated accidents, especially during church visits or feast days. A peasant father might gently scold, while a noble tutor could impose shameful chores, scrubbing chamber pots for the entire week. Some families trained their children using small training stools, carved with holes in the middle and placed over pots. Others simply guided them to the corner of the yard and waited. Urban households, pressed for space, sometimes designated child corners behind curtains. Hygiene was inconsistent. Children often washed their hands in shared basins, if they washed at all. But many households believed cleanliness encouraged good spirits. A clean child meant a blessed home. Superstitions shaped the process. Some believed children who learned late would grow up lazy or dishonest. Others claimed a child's first successful use of the pot should be marked by throwing dried lavender into the fire to thank the household spirits. A rare few celebrated with bread dipped in honey. The symbolism was obvious. There were, of course, mishaps. One chronicler recorded the tale of a young page who, during his first court appearance, soiled himself in front of a duke. Rather than punishment, the duke laughed and declared even squires must start small. Despite the difficulties, toilet training was a family affair. Older siblings often helped, sometimes proudly teaching younger ones, like passing down a sacred rite. Grandmothers whispered old tips: tickle the back, not the belly, or warm the seat with a stone first. In the end, it wasn't just about waste. It was about discipline, dignity, and readiness to be part of a world that valued order, even in the most natural of acts. And for a brief, wobbly moment in every child's life, the humble chamber pot became a throne of triumph. In the undercroft of Graythorn Keep, beneath a heavy oak trapdoor and 2 iron bolts, lay a world of shadows, moans, and rot. It was not death, not yet, but something slower. It was prison. Here, behind bars, chiseled from damp stone, men waited, some for trial, some for ransom, some simply forgotten. And all of them had to relieve themselves. But no one had planned for that. The most common solution, the floor, or a corner. Or, if lucky, a bucket shared by a dozen inmates, emptied whenever the jailer remembered, which could mean days. The stench was unbearable. Yet the guards, noses covered with wool, soaked in vinegar, rarely cared. They're already condemned, they would mutter. Why waste water on their waste? Chains made movement difficult. Prisoners with leg irons sometimes relieved themselves where they lay. The sick fouled their own straw bedding. Others tried to preserve dignity by crouching in darkness, turned away from the flickering torchlight. Diseases spread faster in filth. Dysentery, boils, even hallucinations born from breathing in rot. But the filth was also a weapon. Prisoners hurled chamber pots at their captors. Some smeared waste on walls to keep others away. One legend tells of a thief who painted symbols in feces, claiming they were wards against torture. Elsewhere, in the so-called hospitals for the mad, the situation was no better. The Hospital of St. Dunstan chained its troubled souls to benches along the walls. Each man or woman given a cloth robe and nothing else. No chamber pots, no privacy. The floors were scrubbed once a week, often by terrified novices with gloves made from pigskin. Some physicians believed foul smells were curative, that forcing the insane to sit in their own waste would shock their minds back into order. Others merely didn't care. When nobles fell from grace and found themselves imprisoned, they sometimes brought their servants, including a personal groom of the stool, even in chains. One disgraced knight famously refused to eat unless his privy arrangements were kept according to rank. He starved within the month. Not all dungeons were so dire. In the Tower of London, certain high-status prisoners had private garderobes, narrow shafts leading to the Thames. But even these were prone to backup, flooding cells with what the chroniclers politely called water of the night. Some prisoners tried to dig holes, others prayed. A few created elaborate rituals, assigning turns, crafting privacy screens from rags, maintaining what little humanity they could, because that was the true battle, not against the stone, the chains, or even the rot, but against the slow erosion of dignity. To be imprisoned in the Middle Ages was to be stripped of liberty, name, and often the most basic right of all, the chance to relieve oneself without shame. In the end, many died not from wounds or hunger, but from what they sat in. In the quiet of a candlelit scriptorium, Brother Aldrich dipped his quill into ink and wrote, "Man is but a beast with manners, and proof of his soul lies not in prayer, but in how he hides his filth." It was the 13th century, and while most chroniclers wrote of kings and saints, Aldrich turned his mind to something far more earthly, the toilet. Though rare, a few thinkers in medieval Europe dared to reflect on this most human function and its deeper meaning. Aldrich was one of them. His treatise, De Necessitate Occulta, explored the moral, spiritual, and social implications of relieving oneself. His ideas were met with polite laughter, then quiet respect. For Aldrich, the act of using the privy was not shameful. It was universal, and thus sacred in its own way. Does the king not squat like the farmer? Does the pope not cleanse, as does the beggar? Here, God makes us equal. In Paris, a satirical playwright named Jean Debout wrote bawdy comedies set entirely in public latrines, poking fun at priests, knights, and lovers who met by accident on shared wooden benches. His most famous work, La Confession des Fesses, then excommunicated the actors. Even the great Erasmus of Rotterdam in the following century would write in his Manual of a Christian Knight that one should not strain and shout in the privy, lest the devil mistake thy efforts for a summons. In art, the subject appeared rarely, but strikingly. A marginalia in the Book of Hours of Lady Mirabelle shows a tiny monk on a chamber pot reading scripture. Another, in the Abbey of St. Gall, depicts a devil stealing waste from a sleeping man, perhaps symbolizing guilt or temptation. Theologians debated whether sin could be committed in the latrine. Could one covet privacy? Was vanity in cleanliness a form of pride? Some declared that excessive concern over odors or wiping was a luxury of the idle class. Others insisted that a man who relieved himself too often during matins had demons in the belly. But the most profound insights often came from the jesters, those court fools who could say what no bishop dared. One, named Tom the Flatulent, famously proclaimed during a feast. The hall erupted in laughter. The king nodded. Tom lived to jest another day. In a world where the sacred and profane constantly collided, the toilet remained a space no one escaped. And a few brave minds, be they scholars or fools, dared to look into that abyss and find wisdom. Close your eyes one last time. Walk back through castle walls, monastery gardens, smoky taverns, and stormy roads. Now look closer. They were all doing the same thing. From the humblest shepherd to the most gilded queen, every soul in medieval Europe bowed before the same biological truth. Hunger could be silenced. Desire could be shamed. But the call of the body, who had privacy? Who had to beg for it? Who was allowed to sit in peace? And who had to hide behind bushes in fear of devils? Every latrine told a story. A royal garderobe whispered of vanity disguised as architecture. A mother's wooden potty echoed with lullabies and warnings. Some treated their chamber pots as thrones. Others feared them as gateways to hell. Still others, bravely or foolishly, found comedy in the stink. But none could escape it. For all its myths and monsters, the medieval world was deeply human, and that humanity showed itself most honestly, not in the grandeur of cathedrals, nor in the banners of war, but in the moments no one painted, no one chronicled, no one wanted to remember. And yet, here we are, remembering, because, in the end, understanding a civilization isn't just about what they built. It's about where they went when no one was looking. And so, from the rattling chamber pots of castles to the ash-covered pits of peasant homes,